Hello and welcome to this Holocaust Memorial special as we mark International Holocaust Memorial Day, and we have a very special interview today with a Holocaust survivor. His name is Manfred Goldberg. Manfred, warm welcome to this Holocaust special as we mark International Holocaust Memorial Day. It's an absolute pleasure that you can join us in our studios today, and I have your grandson to thanks for you being here, Uriel, who's appeared on the programme I do, the Middle East Report, who's a wonderful paramedic for the Magen David Adom, as well as an IDF reservist.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you for your kind remarks.
And Manfred, should we start with your story? So you were born on the 21st of April 1930 in Germany into a Jewish Orthodox family. Can you share something about your family background?
Yes, I can and will. Both my parents were born in Poland. They came to Germany as youngsters. My father was, I believe, around 19 years old when, as a single person, he came to Germany. He acquired some friends of similar background. He was not unique in doing this. Things in Poland were going from bad to much worse. It was towards the end of the First World War, and anti-Semitism was prevalent and growing. And my father probably was rather ambitious and wanted to have a better life ahead of him. So, with his parents' blessing, he left home, made his way into Germany. He had to earn a living, but he was more or less penniless. He came from a good, highly respectable family, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. He himself was a man of integrity, and as a result, he managed to make contact with one or two wholesalers who were selling textile goods. And he came to an arrangement that they would give him a quantity of these textiles free of charge, and he would pay them as he sold it. He would pack a suitcase full of these goods, which he had selected at an agreed price, and he would travel as a single person into the suburbs or nearby villages around the town of Kassel. He would just knock at doors and persuade, usually it was the housewife because the husband was out working, to allow him to display the goods he had in his suitcase. He had practically no overheads, so he could be very competitive in price. And whatever the lady selected to buy, he would actually, I think he may have been ahead of his time, but effectively he allowed her to purchase it on hire purchase. She just had to pay a deposit, and then he would come at weekly intervals to collect a further payment, which worked to his advantage as well, in that he had an opportunity to show her new goods, so that the customer tended to remain a permanent customer. As they paid off for what they had taken, they had already selected further goods, and so it was ongoing. And in that, by that method, he gathered quite a number of customers who got to know him because he came pretty frequently, and they realized that they were dealing with a gentleman, a man of his word, who would not take them for a ride. He gave them a fair price, and he dealt with them fairly and honestly. So in that way, he managed to establish a regular source of income. As a single person, it wasn't too difficult. The major problem he had, because he had to leave the town he lived in, which was called Kassel, K-A-S-S-E-L, in central Germany. And having been brought up in a strictly religious home, he had difficulty eating out because there was no kosher food available. So he would pack food into his case and leave Kassel on a Sunday or Monday morning and travel from place to place, usually staying in a boarding house overnight, and came back to Kassel on Friday to have the Sabbath at home. And in that way he was on the road all week. It was, for a young man, quite acceptable. And he built up a regular clientele. He had intended to open a shop once he could afford the overheads. But before too long, the climate in Germany changed somewhat. The Nazi Party were not in power. They didn't come into power until much, much later, after he had married. But their influence began to spread. It was all based on a big lie, of course. They had an ongoing, quite powerful propaganda, anti-Jewish propaganda campaign. They published 1 or 2 newspapers devoted solely to generating Jew hatred. I think the most prominent one, which you may have heard of, was called Der Stürmer. And it was given away free of charge. In fact, copies were pasted up at bus stops, tram stops, so people could just stop and read while they were waiting for the next tram to come. And in that manner, slowly but consistently, that they gathered supporters. And my father carried on doing this, earning his living by traveling for years to come. Eventually, he was introduced to a young lady, also born into an Orthodox family in Poland, who had come to Germany to visit some relations who lived there. They met, and it clicked, and they got married. As a result, I was born in 1930, and a younger brother called Hermie in 1934.
So share with us, Manfred, your first early memories of living in Nazi Germany, because you were born in 1930, the Nazis came to power in 1933. What are your first earliest memories of the Nazi regime in Germany?
Well, things I actually remember are very few. I recall my father taking a day off, and as a little boy, he would take me out for a day. That there was a lovely castle with a beautiful playground adjoining in our town of Kassel. We would go on the tram right up to the castle grounds and spend the day not so much enjoying the inside of the castle as the things that would interest youngsters. And I remember on one such outing, when it was time to go home, we, in the afternoon, began traveling on the tram, got off at our tram stop, and we were walking home when we turned a corner, and there was a huge, huge crowd of people standing there, blocking not the road, but the pavements and sidewalk adjoining, so that it was impossible to walk through. When my father inquired what was happening, they said, well, gosh, you don't know Hitler is coming through here, and we are here to greet him. Well, once the climate was such by then, I was born in 1930, this must have been about 1935 maybe, 34, 35. The climate was such that had we continued walking, having heard that Hitler was coming, it would have caused raised eyebrows, and we would have been sort of suspects of being perhaps anti-Nazi, which was not something you wanted to promote. So my father stopped dutifully, like everybody else waiting there. And sure enough, after a while, a motor cavalcade came past, and in one of the large limousines, there, large as life, stood Hitler with his arm raised in the Hitler salute. My father actually held me up in his arms so that I could look over the heads of people in front, and I distinctly remember getting a glimpse of him as he went by in this motor cavalcade. That was a vivid memory. And my father actually, like everyone else, had to raise his arm and shout Heil Hitler in order not to stand out. Because by then the climate was such that if you were recognized either as a Jew or as someone who was not enthusiastic about the Hitler regime, that was bad news, which more likely than not could have bad consequences.
That's extraordinary, Manfred. Manfred, how did the Nuremberg laws affect your family, particularly your parents, and your parents' ability to work?
Well, initially they didn't affect them severely because they forbade intermarriage between a Jew and a German, which didn't apply to my parents. They forced non-Jewish firms who had Jewish employees to dismiss them. All civil servants who were Jewish were dismissed, including high-ranking ones, like judges even, regardless of background, regardless of how many generations were German-born Jews who were model citizens. Some of them had fought in the German army in the First World War and had won medals for bravery. None of that counted. There came a point when they passed a law depriving all German Jews of their nationality, which meant that they lost many of their civil rights. There was an unceasing stream of anti-Jewish laws being passed once they'd come to power, including laws like forbidding Jews to enter a cinema or a theater. Jewish actors were not allowed to act any longer. We weren't allowed to enter public parks. We weren't allowed to drive motor cars. We weren't allowed to even own a bicycle. Owning a radio was forbidden to Jews. A little later on, there was a curfew for Jews. During hours of darkness, Jews were not allowed to be outside their homes. Later than that, they brought out a law that every Jew had to wear a yellow star on their outer garment when leaving their home, including children, I think from age 4 or 5. And I was older than that, so I had to wear one. Many Jews who, like my father, had come sort of pretty penniless and had worked themselves up by hard work and honest work into a position where they could open a retail shop, became shopkeepers. And what the Nazis began doing was to station a military person outside these Jewish shops to stop and persuade any non-Jew who attempted to enter the shop not to do so, not to give any business to Jews. That was only the beginning. Non-Jewish shops put up posters at their entrance door that either Jews are not wanted or some said entry to Jews forbidden, until eventually a law was passed forbidding Jews to enter non-Jewish shops. There was just one shop which was designated as the Jewish shop, and that is where Jews had to do all their shopping. Whatever that shop ran out of or didn't stock, we were supposed to do without. So life was very, very uncomfortable for Jews. My father traveled to his sort of customers, which he had established over a number of years, for as long as it was possible. But eventually it became too dangerous and he had to stop. And what he did was to turn one room in our home into a sort of stock room where he would stock textile goods on shelves. And these non-Jewish customers were so satisfied with the way my father had treated them over the years that despite the fact that they were not supposed to do business with Jews any longer, they would, some of them, probably not all of them, would sneak to our house, come in and look into the stock room and continue buying from him.
Amazing.
So he still, with great difficulty, managed to earn a living even after officially...
and Manfred, just tell us your memories of a Kristallnacht that's known as the Night of Broken Glass that occurred on the 9th of November 1938. Yes.
I'll tell you something interesting. We lived in an apartment block containing 6 flats, 6 apartments. 2 of them were occupied by Jewish families and 4 by German non-Jewish families. One of these families, whose name I remember to this day, then their family name was Dilling. And Mr. Dilling was a policeman in the German civil police force. And he had become a customer of my father, and they had a nice relationship. And sometime in, I think, late October, they happened to meet on the staircase. Of course, there was no lift. They walked upstairs. Herr Dilling and my father met. Herr Dilling whispered to my father, I can't go into any detail, I probably don't know enough, but I feel it would be in your interest to disappear for a while. My father took it to heart and did leave home to hide somewhere in the countryside, stay in an apartment hotel or wherever. And sure enough, on the night, about 10 days, 2 weeks maybe after my father had disappeared, on the night of the 9th of November 1938, nationwide, a planned anti-Jewish pogrom took place. And the way it worked was that in every locality where Jews were living, they were led by one of the 2 elite Nazi military divisions. The top elite were the black uniformed ones, the SS, who later were in charge of all the hundreds of extermination camps. And the second highest were the brown shirts, who were effectively the bully boys of the Nazi regime, led by a group of these brown-shirted ones. They rampaged through the streets, followed by a large crowd of civilians who had been hyped up into sort of powerful Jew hatred. They would roam through the streets. If any Jew was unlucky enough to be out of doors that night, he would be attacked and either left injured. And I think around 100, all over the country, around 100 Jews actually lost their lives. They actually bludgeoned them to death. They, in each of these localities, made their way into the business locality where there were Jewish shops, and the shop windows had been marked with the letter J for Jewish, for Jude. They would break the front windows, rummage the shop, steal whatever they could, and destroy what they couldn't take. And in that manner, more than 7,000 Jewish shops were destroyed that night. In addition, more than 100 synagogues likewise were destroyed. Close to us, which we didn't actually see being destroyed, but we saw the flames once it had been set on fire. And in that manner, more than 100. Some were much smaller and they couldn't be set on fire because the neighboring properties would have been endangered. But I actually, from our window, looked into the street and I saw one such crowd go past our street on their way to the commercial quarter in order to do what they were aiming for, and that is destroy Jewish businesses. In addition, over the years, many Jewish businesses had been extorted from the Jewish owners. The way it would develop was that he would be approached, the owner, the Jewish owner, would be approached by a Nazi official and told that they wanted to buy his shop, and they would offer him a tiny percentage, usually less than 10% of the market value of the shop. Of course, the owner would refuse, but then gradually they would pressurize him, and it would usually end up with the threat of being sent to a concentration camp if they refused, because there were concentration camps open on German soil already. One was Dachau, the second one I think was Buchenwald. And of course, eventually the owner had to give in and sign a sales contract. So on paper it was a normal sale. The fact that he had been terrorized into accepting a tiny fraction was not mentioned in the contract. So legally, I guess it was a valid sale.
And Manfred, how did your father miraculously escape Nazi Germany, of all months, August 1939, to England?
Well, it was initiated by the Nazis. As I told you, in addition to the Kristallnacht on the 9th of November, that was just a one-night stand when they did all this damage and destroyed thousands of Jewish shops. Consequently, or subsequently, they began arresting Jewish men, just men, not the families, and they arrested a total of 30,000 Jews and sent them to one of these concentration camps. Someone came to our apartment to arrest my father, but he had gone into hiding, so he was not arrested. But when they had reached their 30,000 quota, they stopped arresting Jews. Eventually it was safe for my father to return, and one day there was a knock on our door, and they said, "You're under arrest, we are going to deport you to Poland." The Poles refused to accept him, so they said he would be sent to a concentration camp as well, like those 30,000. My mother very courageously began pleading with the Nazi authorities to give my father his freedom, but they said the only possibility of my father avoiding a concentration camp would be if he had an entry visa to another country. They almost certainly would permit him to leave Germany. So my mother moved heaven and earth to try and obtain at least a visa for my father. We, the family, were not in immediate danger, but he was. But of course it was impossible to get exit and entry visa, it's probably difficult for a younger man like you who has grown up in an era where there have been tens, hundreds of thousands of refugees on the move for as long back as you can remember. And many tens of thousands are given refuge in various countries. In fact, they have it so easy that often they don't seek refuge in the first free country they come to, but they actually aim for specific countries, either because they have family there or because they're treated better than in other countries. In those days, practically every country had locked gates, no entries at all. A few had visa quotas, annual quotas, and the few visas that were available were so difficult to obtain because you had to answer questions galore. You had to find a sponsor in the recipient country who would guarantee that you would never become a liability on the state. So it was very, very, very difficult to obtain a visa, and she had refusal after refusal. Time does not permit me to go into details, but eventually, after many refusals, she managed to see the head visa person, the passport officer, and told him her heartbreaking story that my father would go to a concentration camp unless he had an exit visa. He was not Jewish. In fact, at the time we had no idea, I'm telling you this out of context, we found out only post-war that he was actually a spy, an MI6 spy. And this visa position was his cover for his spying activities. In fact, I can tell you his name. And if you want to read a heartwarming story, you can go online. His name was Frank Foley, F-O-L-E-Y. He gave my mother a single visa entitling my father to enter the UK and a promise that within a matter of a few weeks he felt he would be in a position to give visas to my mother and us two children to follow my father to the UK so we would be reunited as a family there. Well, when this visa was shown to the Nazis, they said, okay, we'll keep our promise on condition that you leave within 24 hours. Well, my father was very reluctant, but my mother said, look, the alternative is concentration camp. It'll only be for a few weeks. I have a promise that we will get visas. So very reluctantly, he left the following day, which was the 20th of August, 1939. Unfortunately, 2 weeks after he left, the Second World War began, and England and Germany were now at war. And of course, there was no possibility of using visas to travel from Germany to the UK. So we, the family, were trapped in Germany. My father made it to England. We had one postcard from him confirming his arrival, and after that there was no contact between us. In the event, for 6 long years, he had no idea of the fate of his family. My mother now had to look after us children. There was no income. We had to live on family savings. My mother had to do all her shopping in that one shop. And shortly before actually the war began, my Jewish school, there was only one Jewish primary school in our town, which I was attending. That Jewish school was closed down by the Nazis, and any Jewish children, there were many who did not go to the Jewish school but went to the national state schools. All Jewish children attending non-Jewish schools were expelled. So there was no education for any Jewish child after that day.
So, Manfred, share with us what happened when you and your family were deported to Latvia.
As you know, my father left in August 1939. We continued living in our apartment. Many Jews who lived in luxurious apartments had those apartments confiscated and were rehoused in shabby apartments in the poor part of town. But we were not wealthy people. We lived in a standard apartment which they allowed us to remain living in. So we stayed there for the 2 years following my father's departure. My mother had difficulty feeding us because it was difficult getting food from that shop. There was often shortage. I don't know that we have time, but I'll tell you very briefly. On one occasion, at least, I think it was twice, my mother asked me to take my school satchel, accompany her, and we went to a corner where there was a non-Jewish baker's shop. Now, as I told you, Jews were not permitted to enter the non-Jewish shops, and I was wearing a yellow star. She asked me to put my school satchel over the yellow star so it wouldn't be seen. She gave me a number of coins and said, now we're watching this shop. When there's no one in the shop, I want you to run across, ask for a loaf of bread, put the money on the counter and quickly run out and come back to me. We rehearsed it until she was sure I knew what I was asked to do, and this is what I did. At the time I didn't fully realize it. In retrospect, I realized how desperate our food situation must have been for a mother to risk her child breaking the law with unforeseeable consequences if I was caught to enter this non-Jewish shop. She must have been desperate to feed her children. And this happened a couple of times when probably she had no other choice in order to stop us going hungry. But life went on like this until late, very late in 1941. There was a ring at our door. 2 of those brown-shirted military men told my mother she had 10 minutes to pack a case for the 3 of us, and they advised her to pack some food and water. They waited while she packed, and then they accompanied us, took us to the nearest railway station, where we found a crowd of Jews waiting already, each accompanied by a similar suitcase. When the crowd had grown to around 1,000 souls, we were packed into a train. We were not given any destination, and we set off on a journey which lasted 3 days, 3 nights. We had no idea where we were being taken. We were not given any food. We had to live on the food my mother had packed. The train stopped, we were ordered out, and we found we were now surrounded by armed guards. They formed us into a long column and walked us into or through a town which we found out was called Riga, the capital city of Latvia. It's about 1,000 miles from Kassel, so we had traveled 1,000 miles in 3 days and nights. They marched us through the town into a barbed wire enclosure within the town. A poor part of the town had been surrounded by this barbed wire fence. And we had to walk into one of a few houses which had the door open and find ourselves somewhere to stay. They opened only about 40 houses for around 1,000 of us, so that meant 25 people per house. They were quite small houses, which meant several families had to share a room. We soon found out, I will try to tell you a bit later on, but I'll tell you what we found out, that when the Nazis occupied Latvia, including Riga, 6 months earlier, they established this ghetto, this barbed wire enclosure, which was known as the Riga ghetto, and compelled 30,000 Riga Jews to vacate their homes and move into that ghetto, also grossly overcrowded. They were put into that ghetto occupied around June, July, and I think by late August, these Jews had to leave their homes and move into the ghetto. Less than 6 months later, the Nazis committed a major atrocity. They lied to these Jews and told them that they were being moved to another camp. And in groups, they began marching them out of the Riga ghetto, the Jews believing that they were on their way to another camp. In fact, they were marched into a forest, which was only a very few miles away, in which they had prepared 3 enormous pits dug by, I believe, prisoners of war, who, I'm told, that this is hearsay, were murdered after they'd finished digging this so that they couldn't spread what they had done. And this atrocity was sort of supposedly secret. As each group approached one of these pits, they were machine gunned, and either they fell into these pits or they were thrown into them. And in a matter of less than a week, they had murdered all 30,000 of these Riga Jews. In this manner, these mass graves are still in situ. Anyone can go into that forest now and view them, that there are now memorial plaques on each of these 3, but 30,000 bodies are still buried there. The ghetto was now completely empty, and around a week or so later, transports of Jews like us from Germany began arriving in Riga. They had murdered these Jews, emptied the camp, and now they were repopulating it with German Jews, like us. We, I think, were transport number 4 or 5, so most of the ghetto was still empty, because they only opened a few houses for each transport. But more transports kept arriving every few days from another town. You know, Cologne, Hanover, Berlin, Nuremberg, wherever there were Jews living, they had a similar experience to us. They were rounded up and packed into trains and taken to Riga, until there were more than 30,000 Jews packed into this Riga ghetto, now German Jews.
Shocking, but can you also share, Manfred, the role of the Latvians in all this and their collaboration with the Nazis?
Yes.
Because I think we also have to look at the role of Latvia during the Second World War and the Holocaust.
There were, of course, lots of armed guards in the camp, and we found out that between 80 and 90%, I estimate, of our guards were Latvian non-Jewish Nazis who had volunteered their services to become guards in the camp. All the officers were German, of course, and a small number of the guards were German, but the vast majority were, as I said, these Nazi Latvians, who were as brutal to us as the Germans were. And we were told by a Nazi SS officer, days after we arrived, we had been put on a starvation diet as soon as we arrived. But he told us that in order to receive that diet, we all had to work. In this camp, this was the only camp in which children under the age of 13 were excused work. In every subsequent camp, and I was in 5 different camps, if you were too young to work, which was usually under the age of 13, you lost your right to live, and children were murdered. In this camp, they allowed the children not to work and stay alive in the camp. I was now in charge of my little brother. I was 11 and he was 7. My mother had to go out to work every day in a group under guard and work in factories. Incidentally, many of the factories, which conveniently were near the camps, this happened in camps all over Eastern Europe. They were purpose-built by German Nazi firms who had been promised an unlimited supply of slave labor if they erected these factories. And as a result, it was a very profitable proposition for them. So not we, but all the adults were led out, worked in these factories, and the guards, these Latvian Nazis, stayed all day watching the Jews at work in these factories. And if due to starvation diet or lack of hygiene or one of a few other reasons, they noticed someone losing strength and not working as rigidly, as sort of effectively, as efficiently as they felt they ought to, they would take them to an execution site and they were shot and replaced by another Jew for slave labor. There was no shortage of replacements. In addition, the second way, the Nazis made sure that they got value for money. The value being the starvation diet, of course we didn't get anything else, was what we call, you may have heard the term before, selections. I'm not sure whether you know what a selection is. On a selection day, we were taken in groups into a nearby hall. We had to shuffle forward, single file, until each one of us faced an SS officer standing there. He would glance at each person and point either left or right, or say left, right. We didn't know the first time it happened, just how significant it was. It meant live or die. And sometimes when elderly parents or grandparents were pointed one way and the children pointed the other way, they actually begged the officer to point them in the same direction as their parents, not realizing that effectively they were committing suicide, because these elderly people, they were told they were being taken to another camp where the work would be less demanding, and in fact they were murdered just like the Riga Jews. That was one way that they made sure that all the people still alive to work were effective workers and not elderly or invalid people. We stayed in this camp for more than a year. I had to look after my little brother daily. Now, in our group, you asked me to speak about my bar mitzvah, which actually happened in this camp.
Incredible.
I'll tell you very briefly what happened. One of the deportees among the group of 1,000 was a gentleman who had been a teacher in the Jewish school, which I had attended. And he was sort of a gentleman with a conscience, and being a teacher, he felt that the children who were roaming in the camp during the day, unsupervised, were at risk. And with great difficulty, and it took some time, he managed to get use of one room in the ghetto to which he could ask each of the children from our town to assemble. And he would attempt to teach us just verbally what he remembered. There were no facilities for a school as such, but it didn't work because there were youngsters who were disobedient and, had no discipline. So he formed us into a choir, from the youngest to the oldest, who was 12 years old. And he began teaching us of Hebrew melodies, which many of us already knew from going to synagogue on the Sabbath day. So that kept everyone's interest, and he had a much easier life keeping us busy.
And Manfred, your story is so compelling that we've barely touched the surface of your incredible story. So we're going to have to record this a second part. But tell us more about having a bar mitzvah in a ghetto, because that is an extraordinary story that I haven't heard from many Holocaust survivors.
No, I have not heard of anyone having it. The way it happened is that we assembled each day, as I told you, and spent the day singing melodies. He taught us new melodies as well. And one day he said to me, you know, you're past your 12th birthday, your Bar Mitzvah is coming up. This is the ceremony which happens when you're age 13. Would you like me to teach you? I said, yes, yes, please. And he began teaching me. What it consists of is learning a text, how to read a text in a Torah, which is a handwritten copy of the Old Testament, without vowels. It's quite intricate to read, at least for a youngster like this who's never done this before. And he taught me, and these scrolls are quite precious. And how did we come to have one there? When these Riga Jews were forced to move into the ghetto earlier, before they were taken away to be murdered, there were quite a few of them were rabbis of synagogues in Riga. And a rabbi, of course, has one of these Torah scrolls dear to their hearts. So many rabbis took a scroll with them into the ghetto. When they were taken away 6 months later to be murdered, they were not allowed to take anything with them. So all this was left behind. We were housed in the same accommodation, and we found these precious scrolls. So he managed to get hold of one of these scrolls temporarily and began teaching me what he calculated. We read a different portion each Sabbath of the year, and he had to calculate which Sabbath it would be sort of a year or so ahead. So he did it in his head. He was quite a remarkable man, and he selected that portion to teach me. And on that Sabbath, although officially everyone had to go to work, he managed to assemble 9 men, because we need a quorum of 10 Jews to have this ceremony. I was counted for the first time in my life as one of them, because under the age of 13 you don't count. But now, as I was 13 plus a day or two at my Bar Mitzvah, I counted as number 10. So we had these 10 people, we had a Sabbath morning service. I did what was required from a Bar Mitzvah boy, and that was the official Bar Mitzvah. Quite remarkable. At the time I didn't realize just how unique it was. In retrospect, of course, I blessed this man. I tried to find him. We were separated, but instead I had confirmation from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem that in 1944 he was sent to Auschwitz and he was murdered.
Wow, but what legacy he left for you to tell this story. Yes,
I will never forget him as long as I live.
And Manfred, just share with us what happened, because you were in Riga. We saw that, did you hear the noise of the Red Army in the background fighting?
No, we did not. Every morning we had to assemble, and that morning, incidentally, each one of us had lost our names. We had been given a number. My number was 56478. I'll remember it as long as I live, because you were punished if you forgot it when you asked to quote it. That morning, numbers were read out, and each person whose number it was had to step forward. I stepped forward, my little brother stepped forward, and my mother stepped forward. All 3 of us were selected. We were packed into cattle trucks and taken to our next camp, which was a labor camp, where everyone had to work to stay alive. I was now age 13. I was 11 when I was taken to Riga, 13 when we were taken to our next camp. I was selected to be strong enough to be a slave laborer. Both my mother and I were selected to become part of a group of around 300 who were taken to a nearby railway junction to repair bomb-damaged rail sections. The Allies had begun bombing the German railway system because they had become aware that all German military transport, reinforcements, munitions, food, is all transported by rail. So if they could damage the railway system strategically in important sections, they could damage the German war effort. So the Allies began bombing, and they used us as slave labor to dig up the bomb-damaged rails, level the ground and lay new rails to make it serviceable again. But the Allies kept coming back, so that no matter how quickly we repaired, we were taken to the next bomb-damaged section. For a whole year, we were taken from one bomb damage to the next, repairing them. My little brother, remarkably, was one of 4 youngsters who were allowed to stay in the camp during the day. We really thought that they had a human spark in their hearts allowing them to live, because we knew in labor camps, and if you didn't work, you didn't live. So they stayed alive, but after about 5 weeks in this camp, we returned one day and the children had disappeared. It turned out that 2 SS officers had come, taken them away, and they disappeared off the face of the earth. To this day, we have not had any information as to what happened to them. We can only surmise from what I've already told you that the Nazis had no use for non-productive Jews, and these 4 children, more or less certainly, although we have nothing to confirm, were murdered the day they were taken. Including your younger brother? Yes, including he was the oldest of the 4 children. He was 9 years old.
Horrific. And Manfred, share with us about this refugee camp that you were based in, the Black Sea, Strutov.
Yes. We were sent to other small labour camps, but just in transit. A few months in the next camp where we also had to repair railway lines. Then for just 3 weeks in yet another camp, but in order to speed things up a little. Otherwise, you'll have me here talking for a day. I will tell you that we were sent from this labor camp to Strutov concentration camp. But we became the envy of the camp when it became known that we would be sent on to another labor camp, because Strutov had an entrance gate. It's not as famous as the Auschwitz one, but the entry gate to Strutov was known then, and it now has a plaque on it which says this gate was and still is known as the Death Gate, because in practice, once you walked through that gate into Strutov, it was a death sentence. Very few people left Strutov alive. And we became the envy of the camp when it became known that our group of 300 would be sent to another labor camp. Indeed, after a few weeks, we were sent to the next camp, and we found out why they had kept us alive, because we were doing exactly the same work as in the previous camp, repairing bomb-damaged railway lines. It was also near a busy junction. The Allies were doing the bombing there as well, and we carried on. We were there for 6 months, where we witnessed an atrocity where 8 innocent people were murdered because some inmates had stolen some fruit. In revenge, they hanged 8 people, and we had to watch them being murdered. Then we were packed into a cattle truck train again and taken back to Strutov. Now we were not in transit, we were there as inmates. This was right at the end of 1944. Strutov, mid-war, around 1942 to beginning of 1943, was enlarged. It was quite a small camp initially, and they trebled it in size. And while they were doing the enlargement, building dozens of new barracks, they also built a gas chamber and a crematorium into the camp. Until then, it did not have it. It opened in 1939 without gas chamber or crematorium, but in mid-42, they built this gas chamber and crematorium into the camp. And now, of course, it had a means of mass extermination. Before, people could only be murdered by the dozen. Now they could murder them by the hundred.
And Manfred, there has been a recent case where a woman who was a typewriter at this concentration camp is actually facing prosecution for war crimes. And essentially we're saying, how could they not know that exterminations were actually taking place at these Nazi death camps? And how did you become aware of the horrors that were taking place and that executions were taking place against the Jewish inmates in this prison camp?
Well, we soon found out, because we were in the camp. Trainloads full of Jews arrived periodically, that the Allies were retreating, were forcing the Nazis to retreat from the eastern countries, where they had hundreds of camps, and the Nazis didn't want survivors to fall into the Allied hands. So they packed all Jews who were still alive into cattle trucks and brought them to camps which had extermination facilities.
Manfred, I had the privilege almost 10 years ago of interviewing a very close friend of yours, Ziggy Schipper, who was also a Holocaust survivor. Share with us how you met Ziggy and how you became lifelong friends for 80 years.
After our 3-week spell in Stutthof concentration camp, we were sent to another labor camp called Stolp, S-T-O-L-P, where we did exactly the same work as in the previous camp, repairing bomb-damaged rails. The Allies had realized that the rails are absolutely vital for the German war effort, and they kept bombing, destroying busy rail junctions. We were used as slave labor. They began to bomb more intensively, and it was felt that our group of 300 was insufficient to do the repairs fast enough for the Nazis' liking. So one day, some extra labor appeared, and among that group, there was just one youngster, roughly the same age as I. And because we were the only young people still around there, most of the young people had been eliminated, murdered in other words, we sort of drifted towards each other. Although his main language was Polish, mine was German, we soon found that we had a language in common, Yiddish, and we began conversing in Yiddish. And that led to a friendship between us. There wasn't much time for socializing because we had to work hard. But we worked together for around 6 months in this camp. Then I was sent to another camp. Ziggy stayed behind. We were separated, and neither of us knew whether the other was still alive. Eventually, at the end of 1944, I was sent back to Stutthof for an unspecified spell. The first time we were in transit, but this time we were just inmates in Stutthof. So Stutthof was by now an extermination camp. What happened while I was there is that trainloads of Jews from the east were transported to Stutthof, and quite inexplicably, to this day, I cannot find logic behind this, how it was decided which trainload of Jews would be checked into the camp of Stutthof, and other trainloads were taken straight to the gas chamber to be murdered. But that's exactly what happened. These trains came at irregular intervals, but there was no foretelling whether that group of Jews transported would be lined up and checked meticulously into the camp. They had to face a clerk across a desk, and a form was filled in before they were allowed into the camp, which effectively meant a slow death by starvation, or taken straight from the train to the gas chamber to be murdered in a matter of hours, and then sent on to the crematorium for their bodies to be burnt. It was brutal, more brutal than it ever had been in Stutthof. People died in their bunks every night, a group was appointed who had to check every bunk bed every morning to lift out bodies of those who had died overnight, to lay them on the ground outside from where they were transported to the crematorium for burning. That was Stutthof. There was sort of a double security around the perimeter. There was a high voltage electric fence. In addition, there were guard towers at intervals manned by armed guards. And it had reached a stage where people were so emaciated, just living skeletons, bone and skin, that they couldn't face any more punishment. And occasionally someone would try to reach the electric fence to electrocute themselves to end their suffering. But the majority didn't make it, because if they were spotted by the armed guards, they would just be shot before they reached the fence. Occasionally someone actually did manage to electrocute themselves, but quite rarely. That was a sort of more or less daily experience in Stutthof. Food was insufficient. There were insufficient tin cans, for instance. We had to line up for our daily ladle of sort of coloured water, which passed as soup. If you were lucky, you managed to find one or two bits of potato peel, not potato peel, and the outer half-rotten leaves of cabbage floating in there. And if you were unlucky, the food ran out before your turn came. You had to shout out your number, which was ticked, to make sure you couldn't go around a second time. And that is how people survive. I don't know how, survived until April 1945. My mother was also in Stutthof, but she was in the women's camp, which was separated from the men's by a barbed wire fence. During that period when we were there, occasionally I would stand at one side, some distance from the fence. We couldn't come near the fence because the guard made threatening moves with their loaded guns. So standing back from the fence, my mother, my late mother, had the same idea, and she would stand some distance from the fence, and we could just catch a glimpse of each other, which showed each of us that the other was still alive. But
did that give you hope? Seeing your mother, did that give you hope in those?
Indeed, yes, it was very comforting. Even though we couldn't exchange any words, we were too far apart, and it was not safe to come closer to the fence because the guard would shoot. But we knew each that the other was alive. Until one morning in late April, I think it was the 26th of April, 45, during morning assembly, numbers were again called out, and we had to step forward. I had to step forward, and the whole group selected, which was several thousand of us, were formed into a long column. We were marched out of the camp, and as we marched out, we could see a column emerging from the women's camp, which was close to the men's. And eventually the two groups merged into one long column, men and women marching together. We were guarded by armed SS guards. And of course, uppermost in my thoughts was, is my mother marching, or is she left behind in Stutthof? And she likewise had no idea whether I was there or whether I'd been left behind, because not everyone was sent on this death march. So we began searching for each other sort of through the column. And I don't know how long, it seemed to take an eternity, but eventually we found each other, and we were overjoyed, because although we had no idea what lay ahead of us, at least we would share the fate we were faced with. Anyone who trailed behind, didn't have the strength to keep up the tempo of the march and began trailing behind, was shot mercilessly by the SS, and their bodies just left where they fell. So my mother and I now marched together with our last ounce of strength. And believe it or not, while searching for my mother, I bumped into my friend Ziggy. I had no idea he was in Stutthof. You know, I left him in the other labor camp. I had done the rounds 2 other camps in between before I reached Stutthof. And we each had no idea whether the other was still alive, but we found each other by chance, marching in this column while I was searching for my mum. So the three of us marched together through most of the day till we reached a small port. There were 4 ancient barges made of wood, held together by pitch, I think. We were packed into these barges. 4 tugs appeared, which were manned by SS teams. They towed us to sea, and we were towed around for 6 days. We had to sit with our legs wide apart so that the person in front could sit tight against us, their back touching our chest. And we weren't allowed to get up. We had to sit like this. We were not given a scrap of food or a sip of water for 6 days. And each of these 6 days, we stopped at some point. An SS officer appeared at the top of the barge, looking down at this mass of humanity, close to 1,000 people packed in. They were not all Jewish. In fact, probably half or less than half were Jews. The rest were non-Jewish Poles. Some prisoners of war of various nationalities were also there. Now, I didn't know at the time that they had been fed a much better diet in Stutthof due to the intervention of the International Red Cross, and therefore they were physically much stronger. A group of them was selected, and he looked down from the top, this SS officer, fastened his eyes onto one of us, and that group of inmates he had selected had to drag that person up to the top deck. Then we couldn't see what happened. All we could do was hear a heart-rending scream followed by a splash. On the SS man's order, that person who had been dragged up was thrown into the sea to drown. And in that manner he murdered but between 20 and 30 people each day before he disappeared. But he reappeared the next day to repeat that, telling us they were using too much fuel towing us. They were lightening the load of the barge. This went on for 6 days. The tugs disappeared periodically to refuel, but then returned after a short time. On day 6, they disappeared again, but didn't return after the regular time, when they normally did. And we stood there for hours. Eventually, a group of the prisoners of war, who are said were in better physical shape, clambered onto the top deck. And the message came down that we were quite close to the shore. They could actually see the shore clearly. It was just a few hundred meters. And then the message came down that they were intending to bring the barge to the shore. What they did was prise loose some very long wooden boards, formed themselves into a sort of rowing team, using the boards as paddles. They tried in unison to row this barge towards the shore. It seemed an impossibility with hundreds of people on board the barge. But eventually the message came down from up there that the barge was responding. It was moving ever so slowly. They continued until they were utterly exhausted. By then others had been encouraged to take their place. Various teams rowed all day long into the night. There was no sign of the tugs returning. They rowed through the night until shortly before dawn, we suddenly reached ground. We've run ashore. And anyone who still had an ounce of strength clambered onto the top deck to try to get off the barge. And we found that one had to jump into the water and wade ashore. My mother encouraged me to do that. I was frightened, but she said she would take care of me. So those of us who still had an ounce of strength clambered up, jumped, and made our way ashore. It was a very dark night. Some people on the barge had reached the point of no return. Their minds no longer functioned. They sat there in a stupor, didn't take any notice of what was happening around them, and just sat there. Others jumped. It was a very dark night. Once we got ashore, we had no idea which way to turn. There was nothing to indicate habitation, turn right, left, straight on. We had no idea what to do next. And while there was a discussion which way would lie safety, people had different ideas on it. Incredibly, the tugs containing the SS teams returned. They were livid. A group of them went on board the barge and shot everyone who sat there in a stupor. We could hear incessant shooting. Another lot came ashore and rounded us up. We thought we were next. We really thought our last moment had come. But they formed us into a column. By then, daylight was breaking, and they began marching us again. Again, anyone trailing behind was shot. We tried to stay around the middle of the column. It was not safe to be at the back because of the shooting. Lots of people lost their lives that way. Eventually, a column of tanks came towards us, and as they came closer, suddenly a shout went up, "Look, our guards have turned and run away from us." They realized before we did that this was an Allied tank column.
Wow.
It was in fact a British tank column. They came closer, and the SS guards, instead of killing Jews, ran for their lives because they were in SS uniform, armed. We could give evidence how many people they had murdered in the last day or two. And the column reached, the tank column reached us, and there was pandemonium. We're free, we're free. Couldn't believe it. I cannot put into words the joy, ecstasy we experienced. Excuse me. But the tank column didn't stop. They rolled past us, and eventually they were out of sight. Suddenly we became very apprehensive. We thought perhaps the SS guards would come back now and our ordeal will continue. But minutes later, truckloads of British soldiers appeared. They stopped, made us relax. They called up truckloads filled with food.
And Manfred, how incredible it is that it was the British soldiers that liberated you and the rest of the immigrants from this Nazi concentration camp, and considering that this is the country where you made your home. Share with us the kind of reaction from the British soldiers when they liberated you and the rest of the inmates from this Nazi death camp.
Well, they allowed us to rest, marched us gently into a nearby town. There was a large military establishment there. This town was called Neustadt. It was a small town, but they had this enormous German military training school where they trained submariners, because Stuttgart was right on the shore of the Baltic Sea, which is the sea we had been traveling on. We didn't know at the time, but I can now tell you that it was the Baltic Sea. All the military personnel in that military compound was taken away as prisoners of war, and it became our DP camp. We lived, we were told to stay and were allocated rooms in that military compound. Both my mother and I fell ill. We were taken to hospital suffering from typhus, and eventually when I had recovered and she had recovered, she was told that I needed a period of convalescence, which meant sending me to a convalescent home in the country somewhere. My mother was allowed to accompany me because I was still considered a child. We were sent to this convalescent home. When I walked in, there was Ziggy. He had also been sent on convalescence, so we were reunited. We had lost each other at the moment of liberation. There was such turmoil and ecstasy that we were thrown apart. So we were together again, and we stayed there. We were interviewed by welfare officers, asked whether we had anyone anywhere in the world we wanted to contact. We gave my father his name, address we didn't know, but his date of birth, the place of birth in Poland, and said he's somewhere in the UK, we don't know where. They said, don't worry, we'll find him. It took 3 months or so, and they found him. We were now in touch. He couldn't come, he wasn't allowed to see us. Couldn't phone us either, but he was allowed to send us letters and eventually parcels. My mother was heartbroken. She never got over the loss of her little boy. When my father began sending us letters, he enclosed a little photograph of my younger brother. We have lost everything, but he, when he left Germany days before the war, had taken some family photos. He sent us a little photo of my little brother. It occurred to me, I don't know what triggered the thought, that I would like to have a portrait painted of my little brother and present it to my mother. Maybe it'll help her heal a little. I spoke to the matron of the home, and she put me in touch with an artist. Money was valueless in post-war Germany at that time, but British cigarettes were the hard currency. And since my father could send us parcels, he sent us British cigarettes. So we were wealthy in cigarettes, which meant buying anything we wanted. I contacted the artist she recommended, gave him that little photograph, and asked him to paint a portrait of my little brother, paying him in British cigarettes. And I brought this portrait along to show it to you. I gave it to my mother on her birthday. It was unbelievably emotional. I'm not sure whether I did the right thing, but in retrospect, I probably did. She treasured it for the rest of her life, and now I treasure it. It hangs in our home many, many years later. If I may lean forward, here it is.
Of course.
I would like to show it to you.
And this is Hermie.
This is Hermie.
Wonderful picture. Amazing. Incredible.
I don't know the name of the artist. That there's some initial down here, just P. I don't know what it stands for. It's in its original frame. This is what he produced.
Amazing.
And
incredible. Really moving.
That is all we have left of Hermie.
Wow. Thank you for showing us that, Manfred. And also, Manfred, can you touch upon your father's story? Because you've told your story, your younger brother's story, which...
My father was arrested soon after he reached the UK, and he was interned as a possible enemy alien. He was in a sort of a prisoner of war camp, an old prisoner of war camp, which was rescheduled to be used as a camp to house suspected possible enemy aliens. My father was imprisoned in there, not mistreated, just deprived of his freedom, so he couldn't act as a spy, if he was one. After a year or so, he was given the chance to volunteer for the British Army to get released from this camp, which he did. He was trained and he was sent to France, where he told me his regular job was patrolling the perimeter of a large ammunition dump and challenge anyone he found walking along to identify themselves. Eventually, Dunkirk occurred and he was repatriated and discharged from the army because he suffered bad different rheumatism. He was not a youngster. He was over 40 when he volunteered for the army, and this was 3 years later he was discharged. He now had to earn a living. He wasn't allowed to take any job without consent from the Home Office because he was an alien. He had to take a job which assisted the British war effort, and believe it or not, because he was desperate to earn some money, he volunteered to work for a small building firm who were refurbishing bomb-damaged homes, not badly damaged, but sufficiently damaged to need a bit of refurbishment to repair war damage, broken wall, glass, and repaint some damaged walls and so on. And he became a painter. He'd never held a paintbrush in his life before, but he needed a job, and they approved it because it assisted the war effort. So he worked there, earning a pittance. So when he applied for us to come to the UK, it didn't go smoothly. We stayed in that convalescent home for more than a year, or maybe just about a year. In September '46, we finally received permission to come to the UK, and we were reunited. It was a bittersweet reunion because my little brother was missing. We were not a complete family any longer. But I was incredibly fortunate, one in probably a million, who had gone through the camps as a teenager and had both parents alive post-war. Everyone else I know, and I knew many survivors, either were orphans or at best, a very, very few of them had one parent alive, but I don't think I can remember a single one who had a loving home like I did. And I have much to be grateful to my parents for, because I'd missed 7 years of schooling. They deprived themselves of many necessities to pay for some private education for me. And eventually, after years of working hard to catch up educationally, I never caught up completely, but sufficiently to be accepted at university, I finally graduated and became a professional electronics engineer.
Amazing. And share how you met your lovely wife, Shara.
Well, I had 2 uncles who pre-war became Zionists and went to Palestine. They were the only relatives who survived. Our extended family who born and lived in Poland, of around 80 plus souls, were all murdered, not one survived. But these 2 uncles in Palestine did survive, and my mother was their only relative, their blood relative, a sister. They were her brothers. One of them in particular wanted to come and see his sister. Eventually he managed. He came to stay. They gave him leave, and he came to stay with us for 6 or 7 weeks. And the Jewish world is a small one. Word got around that my uncle who had gone back in the 1930s to Palestine, was now in the UK, and some old school friends who had made it and had survived found out where he was staying and came to see him. And of course they had long chats, having not seen each other for probably a couple of decades. And they mentioned a particular name, and nobody knew how to contact this person. So I fished out a telephone directory, began phoning them. One of them said, "I'm not sure that I'm the family your uncle wants, but I'd like to see him." They came along, had a long chat with my uncle, found we were the wrong family, but he came with his wife, and his wife had spotted me. I was a young, eligible person, and he lived just a couple of doors away from my wife's family, from my Shari's family. So his wife got in touch with Shari's mum, said, "I've met a nice young man. Will you permit me to introduce them to each other?" Well, it didn't go quite smoothly because Shari was not keen on meeting someone like this. She wanted to meet her own. But eventually, we did meet. They invited us. Shari knew she was meeting someone. I had no idea there would be anybody there. They just wanted to reciprocate, they told us, for our hospitality. So I walked in there, met Shari. Well, before the afternoon was out, I had her telephone number, and the rest is history. We've been married happily for 62 years now.
Congratulations, incredible. And your wife is here watching this remarkable interview in our studios, and I have to get her on one of the programs. She's got a very compelling and powerful story to tell as well. But Manfred, when did you start telling your story? When was it that you decided that your story had to be told and the world needed to wake up?
I did something very unusual. Within a matter of a couple of weeks of our liberation, I sat down and I made a note on a scrap of paper of all the various key things that happened and approximate dates when they did happen. When we were deported from Germany to Poland, when we were sent to the next camp, and to the next camp, and when we had a selection, and so on. That a long list right through the war to the date of our liberation, which helped me keep things in front of me and sort of clearly in mind. That these memories are lodged in my mind clearly to this day, but I could not imagine myself standing up and speaking about them in front of an audience. For more than 50 years, I didn't speak. I couldn't even speak to my own family, who wanted to know my background in more detail. They knew I'd been a survivor, but I couldn't really tell them my story as I'm telling it to you now. Eventually, in our synagogue, that they had an annual Holocaust Memorial event to which they invited a survivor each year to come and tell their story. And they kept asking me to take my turn telling my story. And I kept refusing because I couldn't face it, it was unimaginable to me until eventually my wife gave me a lecture, not the first one, but she gave me a sleepless night. And the next morning I got up and I said, I'm going to do it. And that was the beginning, my first talk in our synagogue. And once my name was out, I was asked to speak in another synagogue and to a Jewish group here, a Jewish group there. I spoke only to Jewish audiences until I spoke to one, a Jewish audience, where the organizer, who was a very dynamic young lady, said to me at the end that she had been doing this for some time and she had had about 9 or 10 survivors speaking to her. But he said, you're different. You are logical, you speak fluently, you have very little accent. You must begin speaking to non-Jewish audiences. I said, I've never done it. I don't think I would feel comfortable doing it. She said, you must, you must. If I can't persuade you, I'll contact a friend at the Holocaust Educational Trust. And she did. They persuaded me. And eventually I was on the panel of speakers of the Educational Trust. And that is how I began speaking, going to non-Jewish schools, speaking to young students. It didn't take me all that long because I was given a lot of feedback. The history teachers, after allowing their children to listen to a talk given by me, allowed them to sit down and write their reflections on a bit of paper. And they sent me copies of the ones they think was worthwhile reading. And from the feedback, I realized that many youngsters were emotionally very, very deeply affected. I received feedback like, you've changed my life today.
Wow.
I will never forget a word I heard today. Or I'm busy writing it all down because when I get married, I want to be in a position to tell my children what I heard from you today. This must never be forgotten. And that sort of feedback convinced me that it is and also they told me that when one of their teachers gave them a talk, it went in one ear, out the other, because they didn't really know what they were talking about. They had to read it up from a textbook before they taught children. Here, they listened to someone who said, I was there, this is what happened to me. And they said, listening to someone like you is unforgettable compared to a lecture from a teacher.
But also your memory and the way that you can recall in such great detail the incredible events that you
But I have spoken to thousands of people in schools and also to adult groups. Like I've even been asked to speak to MI6, for instance, to the Bank of England, with the Chancellor being present, to head offices of various banks, to industrial firms who are household names. After a while, people got very interested, and I felt that it was imperative for the Holocaust not to be forgotten. So as many people as possible should hear about it because it's an effective education.
Absolutely. And Manfred, share with us your bravery and your courage and your experience of going back to Strotov, but this time with the Prince and Princess of Wales back in 2017. So not only did you revisit that horrific Nazi concentration camp where you got these appalling memories from, but you also accompanied by royalty.
All these years, before I began speaking and even after I began speaking, I had never ever set foot again on German soil after I came to this country in 1946. I felt I'd really come to paradise once I'd settled in this country. It was something unbelievable. I began living only when I was 16 and came to this country. And it was wonderful to live a free life, doing what I fancied doing without any sort of threats hanging over me. I wanted my children to look forward and be normal human beings, not survivors, second generation survivors. So I brought my family up quite normally, and I never looked back. I never went back to any of the camps until out of the blue in 2017, which was I remember 72 years after I left Germany, 1946 to 1972. I was contacted by the Educational Trust, and initially they were quite mysterious. I had to meet some VIPs there. They said, eventually they owned up and told me it was going to be the Prince and Princess of Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, amazing. Prince William and Princess Kate. I found it a very emotional, seismic request. I had to think long and hard before I could agree to go back to that most brutal camp of Stutthof. But I decided I must do it. So I did. And my friend Ziggy, who had also been in Stutthof, was the second one who was asked to go back and meet them. We met the young couple, and although we had been briefed how to behave towards royalty, once we'd met them, that there was such harmony between us. They're such a friendly, informal couple that we really felt we were talking to two lovely people who we would like to be friends with. And they asked many questions. There is a sort of very primitive museum in Stutthof now, which has been very sanitized. It doesn't reflect the cruelty. Physically, it resembles the bunk beds we slept in, or the convict clothing we wore, that sort of thing. But it didn't reflect the daily threat to life. So they asked us many questions. They realized that this was not the full picture. They had us two be paired off. I spoke mainly to Princess Kate because we were walking along a long path, and it was not wide enough for us to walk side by side, so we split into two lots of two, walking behind each other. So I spoke mainly to Princess Kate, and my friend Ziggy spoke to the Prince William. We did eventually stop, and all four of us exchanged conversation, but they asked many questions which were raised by walking through that museum. And I've met Princess Kate since several times, and she has told me that although it's years now since we first met, she has not forgotten and will not forget what she learned that day.
Wow. And you have been invited to many dinner parties at Buckingham Palace as well. So I'm in the company of a real VIP, aren't I?
Yes. Years later, I was contacted out of the blue that I had been chosen by Prince Charles, as he was then, to be one of 7 survivors whose portraits he had commissioned to be painted to hang in Buckingham Palace, as not so much as for personal grandeur as a memorial to the 6 million Jews, to help ensure that memory of the Holocaust will remain alive after there are no survivors around any longer.
Extraordinary, Manfred. And Manfred, I know that you're a bit reluctant to share this, but share with us, please, how you saved your friend Ziggy Schipper's life.
When we were walking, well, actually, while we were speaking to the royal couple, while Ziggy was talking to them, we were all 4 together. Suddenly, Ziggy turned to them and said, "You see my friend Manfred here? If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be standing here. He saved my life." And I was quite embarrassed by it. It had never come up before. And what it related to was, while we were walking out of Stutthof towards these barges, which I mentioned earlier, Ziggy had already begun suffering from typhus. All of us were weak, but he was more or less at the end of his tether. He turned to me and said, "Manfred, I can't walk another step. I can't." I said, "Ziggy, if you sit down, you're dead. You see what happens if you trail behind, they shoot you." I can't, I must sit down." I said, "Ziggy, come on." And I put my arm round him and began dragging him rather than walking. And it was quite hard because I wasn't exactly a strong lad by then. We were all pretty weak from starvation. And one other kind person saw what was happening, and he came along and helped me support Ziggy from the other side. And we dragged him along to the barge where we could sit down. And that is how we saved him from trailing and being shot. That's what he meant by saving his life.
Incredible. And what are your reflections now, Manfred, 79 years on from the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau by the Soviet Red Army that marks International Holocaust Memorial Day? And the leaders of the world after the Holocaust said, never, never again.
Yes.
Those sentiments feel very hollow right now, don't they?
I believed them. When I came to this country, every politician was shouting it from the top of their voices, never, never again. Trust me. I did trust them. I never dreamt that I would ever experience anti-Semitism. And what's more incredible, Holocaust denial. While there were survivors around who were eyewitnesses, went through it. And yet, hordes of people deny it ever happened. All they have to do is go to Stutthof. There's a gas chamber and a crematorium which has not been destroyed in practically every camp. The Nazis destroyed the evidence, but in Stutthof they attempted to. They laid dynamite around it, but it didn't blow. For some reason it was on a timer and didn't destroy these buildings, so they're still there. It's, as far as I know, the only camp that still has a crematorium and a gas chamber completely undamaged. I was amazed when I came there and saw it was still there. But this is where we are now. I think that one of the main culprits are these social websites which have become very powerful in the last 10 years or so. And young people have become addicted to it. And because these websites are totally out of control monsters, in my opinion, now.
You mean social media? Yeah.
The owners, the ones who dictate policy on these websites, they say all the right things, that they're going to be selective. In fact, they're not doing anything. They put profit above everything else. They have absolutely no morals except profit. And they allow young people to be indoctrinated. I think they have damaged a good proportion of our youngsters over the last 10 or so years.
Manfred, aren't we living in a time when we're facing a huge paradox? Because in terms of Holocaust education, there are still survivors like yourself, you're very few, but there's still survivors telling their remarkable story.
Yes.
We have films, Hollywood films about the Holocaust. We have drama series, we have books, newspaper articles, even, you know, in the West we have International Holocaust Memorial Day throughout the world. It's on the national curriculum in England, I think in Wales as well. And, you know, people know about the Holocaust, but why are we seeing that with this huge knowledge about what happened, are we seeing at the same time such a rise of Jew hatred that we haven't seen since your childhood back in the 1930s?
No, absolutely not. You're spot on. And the explanation, which to me seems pretty self-evident, is that being addictive, youngsters have no other source of news. They have nothing to contradict these blasphemous lies which they hear on social media. That becomes their outlook. This is gospel truth to them, because they don't know any other facts. They don't read newspapers. They don't have no access to the way things really are, who really are the monsters and who are the goodies. They seem to have lost the ability to differentiate between evil and good. What they hear is no longer classified into either evil or good. What they hear is what they absorb, and that becomes their outlook in life. So that they're effectively brainwashed. And judging by what we have been seeing happening every Saturday when these protest marchers march through London, it seems to have affected not only Muslims who probably are sympathetic towards their fellow Muslims initially, but also a good proportion of British youngsters. And I find it frightening that these youngsters will be the leaders of tomorrow. And unless their mindset can be sort of readjusted to differentiate between truth and propaganda, vile propaganda, and that is a very, very difficult, more or less impossible thing to do, because nothing can match the power of the social media. People like me speaking, who can I reach? I can reach thousands, tens of thousands. On social media, they can reach hundreds of thousands in no time at all. So I really do not know. But what I do know, and I'm not afraid to say so, you may think me a fanatic or an idiot, maybe, but my true feeling is that unless they are brought under some sort of control fairly quickly, time is running out, our very Western way of life of freedom and democracy will be at risk.
I couldn't agree more.
Don't think it will stop with Jew hatred. These things never stop, they progress.
Oh,
One
exactly.
thing leads to another. These monsters want to control the world, never mind eradicate Jews.
A famous lecturer in anti-Semitism, I interviewed him, and he said that what starts with the Jewish people never finishes with the Jewish
There you
people.
are.
But share with us how the events of October the 7th in Israel, the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel by Hamas, more Jewish people were massacred on that day that we've seen since the Holocaust, and now we've seen this explosion of Jew hatred around the world. You mentioned those vile demonstrations taking place across streets in our capital, London, and across the UK.
Yes.
And there seems to be this outpouring of hatred now to the Jewish people. Isn't it time that our politicians, our government woke up to the dangers that Jew hatred has the capacity not only to destroy its own Jewish community that gives so much to this nation and prospers this nation, but also threatens the very survival of our democracy and our freedom?
What is so ironic, and I'm not sure whether I know the answer, is that these wrong beliefs are being propagated by utilizing the freedom offered by democracy, and using that freedom, they do their best to destroy the democracy, which allows them to brainwash people. So the only way to break it is to stop the 7 days a week flow of poisonous views from these websites. I don't see any other way of countering it, because that in my mind is how it happened in the first place. The few of us, as I said earlier, speaking to young people, speaking to people in professions, can only reach thousands of people. I believe quite sincerely that the majority of residents of this country are normal, law-abiding people who can think for themselves and who know how to differentiate between evil, unprecedented evil, and truth and goodness. And they are very sympathetic that they are not anti-Semites. They probably have a true opinion of the Jewish people's behavior, and that Jews are an asset to every country in which they reside.
Absolutely.
But they are the silent majority, and silence is not going to help us. In fact, I would like to close this presentation by giving every single person who listens or sees this program, and pass it on to those who don't. I would like you to inscribe into your hearts the following quotation. I am not sure who actually coined it, but I would like you to inscribe into your hearts, and I do mean inscribe, never forget, that in the circumstances we face today, silence is not an option. When you witness injustice and worse, never remain silent, because if good people remain silent, evil will triumph.
Yeah, that was the famous quote by Edmund Burke, the conservative philosopher. I have to ask you about God, because you are an Orthodox Jew. You were born into an Orthodox Jewish family. You've kept your faith. And when we look at the Jewish people, despite the horrors, the pogroms, the anti-Semitism, the Jewish people have outlived every single world empire. You've outlived the Nazis. You survived the Nazis. And the Jewish people have outlived the Soviets, the British Empire, the Greeks, the Romans, throughout history. So share something about how the Jewish people are the blessed people of God, that you are his chosen people.
It may surprise you to hear that when I finally rejoined my father, he came from a very religious home, as I mentioned earlier. He had not lost his faith, despite all the horror he went through for 6 long years, not knowing the fate of his family. He had absolutely no contact, didn't know what happened to us for 6 years. When we finally met, he expected me to follow his religious way of life. I had never worn one of these kippot in the camps or after liberation. I put one on because he wanted me to. He began taking me to synagogue. Once I could read Hebrew, but not really understand when I looked at the translations and began to understand how we pray, what language we use praying to God. We call him a merciful and just being, merciful and just God. I thought to myself, that can't be God. How can such a God allow these things to happen to us? But I did not have the heart to break my father's heart by telling him my thoughts. So I kept it all inside, and it was in turmoil. I continued going to synagogue and appeared to be praying, but there was no sincerity, because I couldn't reconcile what I was saying to what was in my mind. Until eventually I began to mature a little, and when I looked around, I really began to realize that we are actually surrounded by miracles without being aware of them or without thinking about them. The miracle of birth, for instance, is probably something, when you begin to think of it, that is indescribable. The mere fact of the way our bodies are constructed, how we can take food into our mouth and it gives us energy, how our heart, what keeps my heart beating for 90 odd years now, what makes me breathe. I'm not aware that I'm breathing. How does an apple tree know to grow apples and a pear tree will grow pears? That sort of thing. These are miracles which we accept as nature. But what is nature? It must all be regulated. The world is such a precision instrument, taken as a whole, that it is inconceivable that there is not someone in charge, and that one must be the eternal God. I began to realize that in the Old Testament, Moses actually pleads with God to give him an insight into God's ways, and God said, "Impossible, my ways are not your ways." And I began to realize that the God I'm supposed to be praying to is the same God that Abraham prayed to. And since he must have been around 3,000 years ago, it must be an eternal God. And he has made us finite beings with finite minds, which gave me to understand that we cannot comprehend beyond a certain level. And the Holocaust is beyond our understanding. And since we cannot understand it, it must be God's will that we shouldn't. He wants us to believe in him in faith, not out of reason. If we knew the reasoning God uses, then we could live our lives to put ourselves in God's good books, knowing what the result would be. But that's not it. God wants us to have faith in him. And in that manner, I acquired faith in Almighty God, and I have become believing religious Jew for the rest of my life from then on. That changed me. I didn't retain my faith. I gained my faith by this train of thought.
Manfred, all I can say has been an absolute honour and such a privilege to hear your incredible story of how you survived the Holocaust and the moral lessons that you've learned from it, that you've passed on to me and you passed on to our viewers. And the fact that in April you'll be celebrating your 94th birthday and that you are speaking at so many schools, giving so many interviews. All I can say in Hebrew is kol hakavod. Toda rabah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
An absolute pleasure.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
I just want to thank you so much for joining me on this very special interview we had with Manfred Goldberg, showing his compelling and remarkable story of how he survived the horrors of the Holocaust and the moral lessons that he's learned from it. It's imperative that we never, ever, ever forget what happened over 80 years ago with the Holocaust and the Nazis.